Guess what? If you bought into the myth that ancient kids were just tiny, miserable adults, you've swallowed a 19th century lie. Blame rigid Victorian scholars and their Hollywood cheerleaders for turning childhood into a dull, toga-clad office grind. The viral myth insists ancient children lived as many adults know play, just endless paperwork and war drills. Those Victorian historians, stuck in their era's moral rigidity, plus Hollywood's grim or invisible depiction of kids, cemented this cruel stereotype. But here's the bombshell: archaeologists unearthed toys like 5th century BCE Greek dolls and Roman spinning tops right out of ancient graves. 1st century writer Plutarch famously griped about teaching children gentleness, before anything else hardly prepping boys for Roman tax season. Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, from the 1st century, straight up commands more play and affection, less harsh discipline. Romans gave kids protective bulla necklaces. Greeks invented elaborate coming-of-age rituals. These weren't mini adults filing tax returns in tunics. Still imagining ancient toddlers stuck in eternal office jobs. Congrats, you're more Victorian than a cucumber sandwich at a garden party. While children in antiquity were regarded as miniature adults, this perception extended to their daily activities, where play was considered unnecessary and life was dominated by work. Hollywood lied to you, and those grim Victorian school textbooks doubled down. Ancient kids weren't just broke little laborers slaving away until their arms gave out. The real villains: stuffed shirt historians from the 19th century and hack movie directors who stamp every historical scene with grimy, starving kids stuck shoveling mud or training as gladiators. If you believed ancient children never played, suffered non-stop, and just waited to get wiped out by plagues, think again. Archaeologists uncovered dolls with moving limbs from 5th century BCE Greece and Roman board games like Ludus Latruncularum buried with kids' literal proof that playtime was deadly serious. Then there's Pompeii, where volcanic ash perfectly preserved cheeky graffiti and stick figure doodles from children, an ancient snapshot of bathroom humor. Babylonian clay rattles baby toys date back to the 3rd millennium BCE. If you bought the non-stop misery myth, congrats, you just binged history's dullest PowerPoint. The real ancient disappointment: no Fortnite in the Colosseum lobby. With little time for play and leisure, it's no surprise that literacy was a rarity among ancient children, reserved mainly for the royal elite. You've been straight up lied to by textbooks and Hollywood costume dramas. The myth that only ancient royals could read and write is pure historical gatekeeping. If you believed that barefoot kids stared blank-eyed at scrolls they couldn't decode, you've been duped by Victorian-era history experts and their romanticized propaganda. They wanted you to think knowledge trickled down like royal manna from their palaces to clueless peasants. But the truth is way messier and way more human. Look at the Diplon tablet from 5th century BCE Athens, a simple wax writing board with language exercises designed for everyday kids, not just the elite. Fast forward to 1st century Pompeii, where graffiti litters the city walls, kids and teens bragging, teasing, and scribbling awkward love poems like an ancient Instagram feed. Archaeologist Rebecca R. Benefiel literally unearthed these ancient group chats. If you thought only a pharaoh's son learned the alphabet, congratulations, Victorian fiction played you like an ancient liar. It's like believing only CEOs can text because president phones were expensive. History is not a royal club, it was a messy, everyday thing for ordinary kids too. The limited education of ancient children reflected broader societal attitudes, where high mortality often led parents to care less for their offspring. You've been fed lies by cold-hearted Victorians and lazy Hollywood scripts. They want you to believe parents in the past treated dead kids like it was just another Tuesday. This brutal narrative is complete fiction. Let's tear it apart. The claim: because child mortality was sky-high, medieval and ancient parents barely flinched when their children died. Thanks to 19th century Victorian historians' dreary essays and sensational blockbuster films, we get a world of stoic, emotionally dead parents. But crack open any 15th century French letter collection, like the Letters of the Paston Family, and you find raw, gut-wrenching grief over lost children on every page. Archaeological digs at Lugnano in the 1990s uncovered Roman children buried with toys and jewelry, hardly signs of indifferent parenting. And medieval art. It overflows with grieving Madonnas soaked in tears and fathers more theatrical than your favorite daytime soap star. If you bought into this myth, congratulations, medieval parents would be horrified at your cold heart. Netflix, take notes, their ancestors invented parental guilt. Moreover, this parental neglect was compounded by educational disparities, as formal learning was largely restricted to boys. Hollywood lied. Ancient classrooms were not boys-only clubs, no matter what every toga party or dusty Victorian historian told you. If you believed that, it's time to burn those textbooks. The widespread myth that ancient girls were trapped in weaving or wine-pouring roles comes straight from self-important Victorian gentlemen and panic-stricken Hollywood epics terrified by the idea of women holding wax tablets, not from any real clay or papyrus evidence. Let's demolish this lie. 21st century BCE Sumerian school lists from Nippur, preserved by the University of Pennsylvania's collection, prove girls studied alongside boys. Roman writing tablets from Vindolanda, on the doorstep of Hadrian's Wall, show girls like Claudia Severa mastering Latin and even writing birthday party invitations, so much for the illiterate sister stereotype. And Hypatia of Alexandria. She was teaching mixed-gender philosophy classes in late 4th century Egypt. Still picturing ancient schools as boys-only zones. Congratulations, you fell for Hollywood's biggest gender scam. Ancient girls could read cuneiform unlike modern filmmakers, who clearly can't read their own research. It's like believing Plato was only into throwing wild toga parties, not philosophy. This gender-based educational divide paralleled other societal practices, such as the Roman and Greek customs of marrying off children as toddlers to much older adults. Hollywood lied to you and that ancient history documentary your teacher tossed on. Also guilty. The myth that Roman and Greek toddlers were forced to marry ancient old men is pure, sensational fiction. Everyone loves to gasp over diaper-clad kids being shoved into wedding togas with men old enough to witness Rome's founding. Blame Hollywood epics and Victorian historians obsessed with drama. They needed shock value to make dusty ancient records seem thrilling. Roman laws like the Lex Julia et Papia Poppaea from the 1st century CE set 12 as the minimum marriage age, but real Roman brides. They married far older. Tombstones from 2nd century Ostia reveal brides in their late teens. In Athens, inscriptions and census data check Sarah B. Pomeroy's groundbreaking work show Greek women usually married in their mid to late teens, not as toddlers. So if you actually believe Julius Caesar tied the knot at 8, congrats, you've been binge-watching Gladiator Daycare Edition. The real child brides. They belong in horror movies, not ancient history. Hollywood sure knows how to twist the cradle. Similarly, harsh childhood experiences can be seen in Sparta, where boys endured abuse and were raised as soldiers from birth. You've been conned by every action flick and macho history book. Spartan boys were not mini Rambos unleashed from birth. Thank Hollywood and Victorian armchair historians for shoveling this brutal, joyless childhood lie. The myth. Spartan toddlers allegedly endured whipping, starvation, and gladiator-style survival games from day one. Blame 300 and its fanboys obsessed with old-school, manly civilization. But crack open Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus from the 2nd century, written centuries after Sparta's fall, and you get more fiction than fact. Real proof. 20th century archaeological digs uncovered carved toys, game pieces, and childish doodles. Yes, even Spartan kids got bored. Ancient tablet fragments brag about music, dance, and poetry contests, not endless mud wrestling. If you bought the story that Spartan 12-year-olds starred in Survivor Ancient Greece, congratulations, you've binged more Zack Snyder than real history. Ready to dump the myth and reclaim your excuse to dodge PE? Such severe upbringings were part of a broader pattern, where many ancient children were thrust into brutal labor as soon as they could walk. Hollywood lied to you. Ancient kids were not condemned to endless, brutal labor. If you believed every grimy movie or preachy history book, you swallowed the Victorians' industrial nightmare projected backwards. They painted childhood as a never-ending sweatshop of misery. Oliver Twist in a toga, shoveling dirt from dawn to dusk. Thanks to their moral panic and every gloomy film montage, this lie went global. Here's the bombshell 21st century digs at Roman British villas. Uncovered toys, game boards, and tiny sandals, clear archaeological proof. Childhood included play, not forced labor. See Gillian Clark, Roman Childhood, late 20th century. Even 15th century Renaissance manuals like Corbaccio acknowledge chores but celebrate festivals, education, and fun. Kids doodled on stone floors while adults worked, learning through community play. If ancient children were eternal slaves, who invented hopscotch? If you bought this myth, congrats, you just fell for a story as outdated and absurd as TikTok teens grinding away at virtual farms all day. Despite their early responsibilities, ancient children were typically excluded from religious ceremonies and public life until they reached adulthood. You've been sold a sanitized bedtime lie credit prim and proper Victorian historians for erasing kids from ancient public and religious life. They scrubbed childhood out of history to make ancient times as dull as their stiff old family portraits. Time to shatter that fake story. Everyone imagines ancient religion and politics as all grown-ups kids sidelined, invisible until they hit 18. Blame Victorian snobs and their uptight obsession with childhood innocence for that myth. Hollywood eagerly amplified it, giving us toga parties filled only with adults. But Greek inscriptions from the 5th century BCE demolish this fantasy. The Araphoroi of Athens were preteen girls entrusted with sacred rituals. Check the Parthenon records. Ancient Roman boys, centuries before the Catholic Church, served at temples too. Livy's 1st century BCE histories prove it. Archaeologists, refusing to trust dusty texts alone, unearthed child-sized ceremonial tunics at Brauron in the late 1980s. So, if you thought ancient priests needed a grizzled beard, congrats, you just failed ancient history. Maybe hand your kid a sacred basket and see if they handle pressure better than a stressed-out Silicon Valley manager. This exclusion continued into the Middle Ages, a period characterized by a lack of privacy and boundaries between parents and children. You've been straight-up conned by Hollywood and prudish Victorian moralists. They want you to believe medieval parents were chaos incarnate, no boundaries, no privacy, just a non-stop family free-for-all. But here's the bombshell: medieval families had sharper parenting skills than your typical suburban sitcom. Everyone loves imagining the cramped medieval household kids shoved into the same room, treated like tiny adults with zero privacy, like one endless medieval frat party. Thanks to Victorian historians and those saccharine, Old England films, this myth spread faster than the Black Death. But rewind to the 15th century, and Le Ménagier de Paris, a famous domestic manual, spells out clear parenting tactics, including separate sleeping quarters. Actual beds for kids. Absolutely, in 13th century archaeological digs, they found child-sized beds and cradles, proving parents valued comfort and space. And 14th century wardrobe records list bespoke clothes for children, not just sad hand-me-downs stitched in a medieval thrift store nightmare. Thought kids snoozed in hay piles surrounded by goats. If you believed that, you just bought a front row seat in the bad history lottery. Medieval parents set firmer boundaries than most influencers preaching parenting hacks on Instagram today. In such environments, discipline was harsh, with brutal physical punishment being the norm throughout ancient and medieval times. You've been sold a brutal lie, Hollywood, and those Victorian penny dreadfuls turned medieval justice into non-stop torture porn. They took everyday discipline and cranked it to Saw-level horror because, let's admit it, nothing sells like promises of a gruesome flogging. Everyone pictures the Middle Ages or ancient Rome as a non-stop festival of whips, dungeons, and agony racks. Watch Game of Thrones or skim a dime novel, and you see the same lazy, recycled nightmare. But here's the bombshell: legal giants like the Assizes of Clarendon in 12th century England and Florence's 14th century statutes mostly doled out public shaming, forced street cleaning, or fines far more often than any torture. Ancient Rome's Lex Julia from the 1st century BCE reserved violence mainly for slaves. Citizens typically lost property or faced humiliations, not agony. Archaeology backs this up. British archaeological reports from 2020 reveal more shaming graffiti and restitution coins than torture tools buried underground. So if your image of medieval justice is all chains and horror, guess what? You swallowed a myth juicier than any tabloid headline. If you think Zoom call breakdowns or school detention are bad, consider that medieval shame parades would have exploded on TikTok. Talk about an embarrassing viral nightmare. This focus on strict obedience left little room for innovation or creativity among children during those eras. Hollywood lied ancient kids were not pint-sized robots programmed for obedience. If you believed Victorian textbooks and lazy movies, you've swallowed a sanitized myth straight from stiff 19th century educators and boring scripts. They paint childhood as a joyless boot camp, just memorizing dusty rules. Zero creativity allowed. Here's the brutal truth: ancient childhood was wild and messy. Archaeologists uncovered children's graffiti all over Pompeii, 1st century wall etchings of stick figures and rebellious doodles. Real ancient artifacts, not silent clones in togas, need proof. In Central Europe, prehistoric bone flutes nearly 20,000 years old show kids weren't just carving sticks, they were serious musicians. Babylonian math tablets from 4,000 years ago aren't boring homework, they contain puzzles and riddles. So next time your toddler redecorates the hallway, tell them they're continuing a wild 2,000-year-old tradition. Roman graffiti artists would be proud. Meanwhile, Hollywood keeps peddling boring Victorian cliches like a bad rerun in a world that's anything but dull. Consequently, cultural expressions like nursery rhymes and children's songs, which foster creativity, were absent before modern times. You've been duped by dusty textbooks and Victorian spin. Hollywood lied when they made you think nursery rhymes just popped up in a modern storybook. The truth: these songs are way juicier and way older. The biggest con: that sentimental Victorians invented children's rhymes during the Industrial Revolution, as if lullabies were some steampunk gadget. Thank Victorian moralizers for scrubbing childhood squeaky clean and claiming they invented lullabies. Here's the mic drop: Sumerian clay tablets from over 4,000 years ago are packed with lullabies, with the legendary poet Sappho penning soothing verses back in the 6th century BCE. Think pat a cake is old. It's in a late 17th century English manuscript, but French and Italian folk traditions show the rhyme is far older. Archaeologists even unearthed Roman baby rattles in Pompeii engraved with rhyme songs, basically nursery TikTok millennia before TikTok existed. So if you believed Mary Had a Little Lamb was an original Victorian hit, congratulations, you just fell for the 19th century remix. Adding to this harsh reality, the phase of childhood was fleeting, with the notion of being a child ending unusually early historically. You've been duped by gloomy textbooks and Hollywood's medieval misery scam. Supposedly, kids in the past blinked twice, and boom, they were adults. If you believe this, thanks for nothing, Netflix. Most people imagine historical children as tiny adults hauling buckets at dawn, skipping all the awkward growing pains. Blame Victorian-era historians and every period drama starring suspiciously mature child actors. They glorify the misery montage. But here's the truth bomb: the legal age of majority in medieval England was 21, straight from Magna Carta in the 13th century, and common law, yes, actually documented. Winchester College, founded in the late 14th century, kept boys schooling well into their teens. Letters from angsty teen Thomas Cromwell in the early 16th century reveal classic coming-of-age drama long before social media existed. 17th century legal records still treated minors, youths, and adults as distinct groups with different rights. If you thought adolescence didn't exist, congratulations, you're just one bad movie away from thinking Hogwarts is a historical documentary. Go enjoy your midnight cereal, you're channeling your inner medieval teen rebellion. Furthermore, child-rearing responsibilities fell almost exclusively to mothers, with fathers and other men largely uninvolved. You've been sold a lazy dad fairy tale spun by sitcoms, sappy Victorian parenting manuals, and Hollywood. The lie that ancient fathers just grunted from armchairs while mothers did all the raising. Complete nonsense. Everyone parrots that only moms cared about kids in the past, and men were clueless or utterly absent. Hollywood comedies and 19th century family values, writers cemented this myth, turning ancient and medieval dads into mere background props. But let's tear up that script right now. Egyptian papyri from the 3rd century BCE reveal fathers fighting for custody, penning affectionate letters, and organizing daily child care. Roman household records and 2nd century CE tomb inscriptions don't just pay lip service. One Roman sarcophagus literally depicts dad holding his toddler, not mom. Greek vases and frescoes boldly display fathers bathing, teaching, and playing with their children. If you believe dads never did bedtime before electricity, congrats, you've mixed up ancient Greece with the Simpsons reruns. Even cavemen had more hands-on dads than that. In addition, societal neglect of children's well-being meant that cleanliness was neglected, leaving ancient kids often filthy. You've been brutally lied to by Hollywood and every medieval movie ever into believing ancient kids were walking dust storms like Pigpen from Peanuts. Blame those Victorian historians obsessed with making their own era look spotless, and lazy filmmakers who slap on mud for cheap grunge. The myth that ancient parents let kids roam filthy and wild because people back then just didn't care about hygiene. If you swallowed that lie, you're not alone. Here's the real filthy truth archaeologists keep digging up: tiny strigils, curved bath scrapers, and miniature oil flasks at Roman digs, proving kids had personalized bath kits. Still skeptical? Soranos of Ephesus, writing a precise medical guide in the 2nd century, insisted on daily baby baths and regular nail trims feral toddlers. Think again. And if that's not enough, ancient Greek and Egyptian baths even featured clay rubber ducks. Yes, actual bath toys eons before SpongeBob floated on TV. So next time someone trots out the kids were always filthy myth, hit them with an ancient rubber duck and watch their so-called historical facts shatter faster than a dropped smartphone.